It was a little more than 5 years ago that the people of Britain headed to the ballot boxes to decide if they should exit the European Union. A consultative referendum that most observers regarded as nothing more than a chance. To quite a persistent minority stunned the globe when the outcome favored leaving. 4.5 years afterward, following a long and exhausting series of negotiations, Britain ultimately withdrew from the EU, concluding its 47-year period of membership. At that moment, there were broad fears that this would stop people from moving back and forth between the UK and that it might potentially shut down certain companies, especially those relying on regular travelers from Europe. And most importantly, it endangered the living standards of ordinary Britons who had gained from EU membership whether they knew it or not. Naturally, many of these fears were realized to a certain degree, though not strictly due to Brexit, but because of the worldwide pandemic that struck the nation particularly severely during the run-up to the official departure date. This has made it challenging to evaluate which difficulties are being experienced because of Brexit, and which difficulties would have occurred anyway. Because of the pandemic, by the same reasoning, and in the spirit of fairness, it has become difficult to decide whether the promises of Brexit advocates were grounded in fact. Considering that event, the strongest financial strategies would be suffering in the international economy of 2021. So, how much harm has Brexit caused to the United Kingdom's economy? Has the UK gained any advantage from Brexit occurring during the pandemic? And finally, what could this all imply for the UK's capacity to rebound from the pandemic? Once we have examined all of that, we can place the United Kingdom onto the Economics Explained National Ranking Board, Bot 1, of the greatest challenges confronting Britain. During the years between the referendum and its actual withdrawal from the EU was the uncertainty over what a post-Brexit Britain might eventually look like. There were numerous opposing viewpoints suggesting everything from it becoming a kind of British paradise, newly liberated from the constraints of the continent, all the way down to total catastrophe, complete with riots in the streets and barren store shelves. Naturally, the latter outcome doesn't sound appealing, but what could have been worse was not truly knowing which direction the nation might take. The most significant and immediate consequence of Brexit was expected to be on trade. The European Union is, before anything else, a coalition founded upon free trade. The nations within the bloc all agree to exchange goods freely with each other without applying tariffs or setting import quotas. This arrangement is further supported by the fact that all of their remaining members have adopted the same currency, the euro, ever since its creation in 1999. Conversely, on the other hand, the EU places strict barriers on trading with nations outside the Uniones, a method of encouraging EU countries to trade internally rather than with external partners. It still takes place, however, and exceptions are granted for particular goods and materials that are scarce within the EU. Natural gas from Russia supplied to Germany serves as a perfect illustration of this. Now, I'm not going to discuss the pros and cons of free trade in this segment, because that's not really the main point. Whether or not this model of open trade is advantageous for its participants, the UK now stands outside it. They have moved from being the beneficiaries of free trade arrangements to the subjects of restrictive trade limitations. This wouldn't be favorable for any nation, but it's particularly damaging for Britain, considering how heavily it relies on trade to sustain its economy. To grasp how significant this is, we must examine a measure known as trade intensity. When economists analyze trade statistics, they generally concentrate on net trade, meaning exports minus imports. When calculating GDP, we include the total value of consumer spending, government expenditure, investment, and net exports. Net exports also form part of the balance of trade and, by extension, impact current account balances. So it's easy to understand why it draws such attention. But think about this. Picture two nations, one that has neither imports nor exports, completely self-contained. Then picture another nation that imports $1 trillion worth of goods within a year and exports $1 trillion worth of goods as well. Both of these nations would display the same net export value, Yet the second example would probably be performing much more successfully. $1 trillion worth of exports would generate employment for millions of workers, while $1 trillion worth of imports would greatly enhance the average living standards of those same people. That second nation would naturally be far more reliant on open trade deals. And that's why it's also essential for economists to examine trade intensity metrics. Trade intensity is simply the combined total of imports and exports divided by GDP. So if we take our simplified scenario of these two nations and assume they both possess a GDP of $4 trillion, the first would record a trade intensity of 0%, while the second would record a trade intensity of 50%. You can clearly observe that trade intensity is often a far more revealing measure of what is truly happening in an economy. So why does this matter for Britain? Well, the UK maintains one of the highest trade intensity rates anywhere in the world. The UK's trade intensity stood at 63% in 2019. When compared with other large developed trading nations such as Australia at 46%, Japan at 35%, and the US at 24%, you begin to realize just how crucial trade truly is for Britain. From a historical perspective, this makes perfect sense. The UK itself is a relatively barren island situated in the Atlantic, lacking many of the natural resources necessary to effectively sustain its economy. It has also long been a major colonial power, so trade was something that naturally developed as it became increasingly significant over the past few decades. This is where the uncertainty surrounding what Brexit would actually mean becomes highly relevant again. Worst-case outcome like the much-dreaded no-deal Brexit, with strict borders and the total absence of free trade with the EU, would not have been ideal, of course, but it would at least have been something to prepare for. Imagine you operated a tool manufacturing company. You own a small factory, a warehouse, and primarily supply precision machinery to clients both within the UK and across the EU. Once those referendum results were announced, you would have been placed in a very difficult position. Without a free trade deal in effect, you would no longer remain competitive within European markets, since you would now need to pay import duties on every tool you sell there. You could avoid this problem by establishing a second production facility inside the EU, but that would require a huge capital commitment. And if the UK later succeeded in negotiating a favorable trade pact with Europe, that investment would have been completely unnecessary. You might also choose to save funds so that you had the cash ready to purchase a factory if needed, but then you're left with a stack of money just sitting idle rather than being reinvested in the company or spent on hiring new workers, or even distributed as dividends to your shareholders. Money left sitting idle, waiting for something to occur, does nothing to strengthen the economy, while money put to use for any of those goals certainly does. If company owners had clarity about what was coming, even if it was unfavorable, they could have implemented strategies to manage it effectively. The mixture of a prolonged decision to officially withdraw, followed by a lengthy transition stage and coupled with the continuing financial consequences of the worldwide pandemic, made it extremely difficult for individuals, companies, and even entire governments to plan beyond the near-term horizon. But now, of course, with the advantage of hindsight, we can finally make a proper before and after comparison of Brexit. Trade levels have declined substantially, no shock there, particularly when you consider the pandemic's effect on travel, logistics, and wider economic activity. Trade intensity declined from 63% in 2019 to 55% in 2020. That may not seem like a dramatic decrease, and it still leaves the UK ahead of most other economies, but this statistic was recorded during the so-called Brexit transition period. That phase has now concluded, and Britain's trade relationship with the EU is currently governed by the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, commonly referred to as the TCA. The timeline shows that the UK officially departed the EU at the close of 2019. The transition arrangement was then maintained through the end of 2020, and the TCA has now been active for just over 11 months. The conditions outlined in the TCA are overall significantly more restrictive than those of the transition deal, and the transition deal itself was notably more restrictive than full membership within the European Union. It is naturally less restrictive than a total no-deal Brexit, but perhaps only slightly. Exports of goods to the European Union have fallen sharply this year, indicating that trade intensity could experience another 10% decline in 2021. Even under cautious estimates, the Center for European Reform has tried to isolate Brexit's impact by using a statistical model called Doppelganger UK to estimate what might have occurred if Britain had stayed in the EU. That study found that since the end of the transition period, leaving the single market and customs union has reduced UK goods trade by 15.8% as of August 2021. A decline of 15.8% is enormous. This directly affects hundreds of thousands of workers, and certainly not positively. Now, even though this is the first issue that most people think about, lost trade may not actually represent the biggest setback to the British economy. It may instead be lost labor. You've probably seen headlines describing empty store shelves and fuel stations turning customers away across the UK right now. Well, that's being driven by a severe shortage of workers. Britain is currently short roughly 100,000 truck drivers, many of whom were non-British nationals who had been employed in the UK under the EU's shared labor framework. You see, before Brexit, any citizen from any EU member state could live and work freely in whichever other country they wished within the Union. This brought certain benefits, such as companies being able to utilize top talent drawn from a broad labor market, and also some drawbacks, like a brain drain luring ambitious young professionals from less wealthy nations to richer ones where pay was higher, deepening inequality. I can genuinely understand the reasoning on both perspectives here, but regardless of all of that, lorry drivers were among the most common professions making use of this arrangement. Driving trucks, by its nature, involves constant movement from place to place, and when that's paired with open trade agreements across a fairly compact continent and language differences not posing much of a barrier to truck operation, it's unsurprising that many European drivers simply followed the regions with higher demand. This arrangement meant the EU as a whole needed a smaller overall trucking capacity than it would have if each individual country kept enough trucks to meet its own needs throughout the entire year. The problem with this setup is that once the UK withdrew from that shared workforce, it lost access to the labor it required to keep the national economy functioning. A similar issue is now surfacing among other categories of seasonal employees, particularly in farming, where laborers from across the channel once handled a major share of the harvest work that happens only 1 or 2 times annually. This is creating worries about empty dining tables this Christmas season, which is sparking panic shopping that is further worsening the supply scarcities the nation now faces. The administration has attempted to resolve these problems by approving 5,000 temporary 3-month visas for lorry drivers and placing military personnel on alert if conditions worsen. Together, this decline in commerce, jobs, and spending has cost the state roughly £30 billion, or just above $41 billion, in reduced tax income. Interestingly, this is about equal to the revenue collected through new taxation policies introduced earlier this year. High taxation during times of financial instability is the direct reverse of what economists advise. Yet the funds must still come from somewhere. The UK's fiscal authority, the Office for Budget Responsibility, has estimated that all of these combined effects will cause Brexit to produce a 4% fall in the UK's long-term GDP, which comes in addition to the 2% decline in GDP expected from the pandemic. Once again, this may not appear drastic, but the UK has not truly experienced steady expansions since the global financial crisis, and this 4% setback could realistically drag its economy back by more than an entire decade in progress. Rankings okay, Now let's place the United Kingdom on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. Beginning as usual with GDP, Britain remains the fifth largest economy globally, with an annual production surpassing 3.1 trillion US dollars. It still trails the major superpowers, America and China, and remains comfortably behind Japan and Germany, but it earns a 910. That total is distributed across 67 million residents, giving the national per-person GDP value slightly above $46,000, 46,344. This aligns fairly closely with its long-standing European counterparts like France and Germany, so it scores a 710. Stability and confidence are really tough to define, since this is an entirely subjective metric. The nation is clearly facing some disruptions, but it has long been recognized as among the most secure countries on the planet, particularly regarding its finance sector. We actually produced a full video about this topic some time back, so feel free to watch that if you're curious. Honestly, it remains a developed state with strong laws, a solid financial structure, a respected currency, and a working democratic framework, so it earns an 810. Half a decade ago, this would have been an effortless 10-10 rating. Economic growth hasn't been impressive. As noted earlier in the video, its GDP still lags behind the high point of 2007. Since that time, it has endured the GFC, the Eurozone troubles, Brexit, and COVID. It's undoubtedly durable and hasn't declined much, but expansion has been stagnant. It scores a 310. Lastly, the industrial sector remains surprisingly robust. The United Kingdom still maintains a vibrant manufacturing base, producing everything from luxury automobiles to advanced aerospace engines. It's also the site of the world's second-largest financial hub, giving it a 910 altogether. This provides the United Kingdom with an overall average rating of 7.2 out of 10, a strong and respectable result, placing the nation in joint third position on the leaderboard along with France, the Netherlands, and Taiwan. Appreciate you watching. Goodbye, mate.